Hey guys. It's nice to have you here tonight. Before we start, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine someone lying in bed on the other side of the world, maybe in a small apartment, or in a quiet house surrounded by snow, listening to the same story I'm about to tell. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere far away, to a world that existed long before the electric light, long before cars or phones, even before the idea of the United States had a name. It's the early 1700s, and we're in the wild, sprawling lands of colonial America. The air smells of pine and damp soil. There are no paved roads here, only dirt paths cut through thick forests. The night sky is so dark that the stars look alive, so bright they seem to whisper stories of their own. Somewhere, an owl cries, and in the distance, a river murmurs beneath a blanket of fog. Our story begins with a man named Elijah Harper. He wasn't a soldier or a nobleman, just a farmer. But like many people in those days, he carried the quiet courage of someone who built his world with his bare hands. Elijah came from England when he was 19. His father had been a carpenter, and his mother, a woman with strong hands and a quiet voice, believed that in the new world, anyone could build a better life. They said America was a place of endless opportunity, a land so vast that a man could walk for days without seeing another soul. But when Elijah first set foot on the shores of Massachusetts Bay, he realized something most settlers discovered too late: opportunity came with a price. The forests were beautiful, but merciless. Wolves hunted in packs, and winter came fast, biting through wooden walls like a ghost. The people were strong, but even the strongest could vanish in a storm or disappear into the trees, swallowed by the silence. Still, Elijah stayed. He built his home near a small village called Norfield, a handful of cabins surrounded by endless pines. His first house was hardly more than a shack, a single room with a clay fireplace and a thatched roof that leaked when it rained. Yet when the sun broke through the clouds and lit the valley, he felt something he had never felt before: freedom. He spent his days cutting wood, planting corn, fixing fences. His hands were cracked and raw, but he didn't mind. Each morning he watched the mist rise from the fields, thinking about the thousands of people who would one day live here. He didn't know their names, of course, but he knew he was building the beginning of something much bigger than himself. Sometimes at night, he'd hear drums in the distance, soft, rhythmic beats echoing through the forest. The villagers said they were the songs of the native tribes, prayers carried on the wind. Others whispered that it was something older, something that lived in the woods long before any man came to this land. Elijah never saw them, but he could feel their presence, like eyes watching from the shadows. There were only a few dozen people in Norfield: a blacksmith, a preacher, a widow who made candles, and 2 children who ran barefoot through the mud. On Sundays, everyone gathered in the meeting hall, where the preacher's voice mixed with the crackle of firewood. Life was slow, simple, and yet filled with small wonders. Elijah often thought about the world he had left behind. In England, he had lived among crowded streets and stone walls. Here, everything was alive: the trees, the rivers, even the silence. It was as if the earth itself was breathing. But beneath that beauty, there was something else. Something that made even the bravest men glance over their shoulders at night. The forest didn't just live, it remembered. People told stories of lights that floated between the trees, of whispers that called your name in the dark, of travelers who followed strange music and never returned. Elijah didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. He had no time for superstition. There was always wood to chop, crops to tend, fences to mend. But sometimes when he stood alone at dusk, watching the shadows stretch long across the fields, he felt it, the sense that he wasn't entirely alone. One evening, after a long day of work, Elijah sat on the small porch of his cabin. The air was still, the world painted in shades of gold. In the distance, smoke rose from other chimneys, curling into the sky like threads of memory. He thought about what the preacher had said that morning, about how every man's life was a story written by God himself. Elijah wondered what kind of story his would be. He didn't know that, before long, his story would become one worth telling. A story of love, hardship, fear, and the strange beauty of a young America that was still finding its name. And though the years ahead would bring war, loss, and change beyond imagination, this was where it began. In a small clearing in the forest. With a man, a dream, and a house made of hope and wood. The days in Norfield passed slowly, measured not by clocks but by the movement of the sun and the rhythm of work. Time felt different out there. The mornings began before dawn, when the mist still hung low over the fields and the ground was wet with dew. The first sounds were always the same: the crack of an axe, the creak of a cartwheel, and the low hum of someone humming a hymn they half remembered from home. Elijah had grown used to the silence. At first, it had felt heavy, pressing on his ears, but now it was like an old friend. There was something peaceful about hearing only the wind, the river, and the rustle of leaves. He worked with a quiet patience, the way people do when there's no one else to depend on. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were no markets filled with goods, no neighbors a few steps away, and no help if something went wrong. Every meal had to be earned. Every fence post, every loaf of bread, every candle flame came from hours of effort. But there was a strange kind of satisfaction in that, a purity Elijah had never known before. He learned to read the forest the way some men read books. The call of birds told him when rain was coming. The smell of the wind warned him of snow. When the first frost painted the edges of the crops, he knew winter was near. And in those quiet moments, with the world waking around him, he sometimes forgot how dangerous this place could be. One morning, he followed deer tracks through the forest with his musket in hand. Hunting was never just for sport, it was survival. The forest was thick and still, the air so cold that his breath turned to smoke. After hours of walking, he found what he was looking for: a single deer drinking from a frozen stream. He steadied his aim, whispered a small apology under his breath, and fired. The sound echoed through the trees, startling a flock of crows into the sky. By noon, he was dragging the deer home, his boots sinking into the half-frozen mud. It was exhausting work, but it meant meat for weeks. That night, the smell of roasted venison filled his cabin, and the flickering fire painted shadows on the walls. Outside, the wolves howled, but inside, it felt safe, warm, alive. The people of Norfield lived much the same way. Each family depended on one another in quiet, unspoken ways. When someone's roof caved in, the men gathered with hammers and wood. When a woman fell ill, neighbors brought herbs and broth. There were no doctors, only old remedies and faith. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Death was not a stranger, it was a quiet visitor who came when he pleased. Children grew up fast here. By the time they could walk, they were carrying firewood or feeding chickens. They played in the mud, built forts from branches, and chased after each other between the corn rows. At night, they sat by the fire and listened to their parents' stories, tales of witches, lost travelers, and miracles that happened long ago. Those stories, half real and half imagined, shaped the world as much as any law or sermon. Elijah often thought about how people back in England would never understand this kind of life. They would hear America, and picture gold or endless fields of grain. But the truth was harsher and, in a way, more beautiful. It was a place where life demanded everything you had, and gave you something in return. Freedom. Some nights, when the fire burned low, Elijah would sit by the small window of his cabin, staring at the stars. He tried to count them once, but gave up after a few hundred. There was no end to them, no edge to the sky. It made him feel small but not insignificant. If anything, it reminded him how much there was still to see, still to build. He had begun keeping a journal, small notes written in rough ink on paper so precious that he used every inch. He wrote about the weather, the harvest, the strange dreams he sometimes had about the sea. But mostly, he wrote about the feeling of belonging to something larger, something wild and untamed. One evening, while he was mending a broken fence, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw a man he hadn't met before, a tall stranger wrapped in a fur-lined coat, his face hidden beneath a hat. The man smiled and nodded. "You're Harper, aren't you?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. "Name's Silas Grant. Trapper. Passed through here once, years ago. Didn't think anyone settled this far north again." Elijah wiped his hands and offered a handshake. Silas's grip was firm, his eyes sharp but kind. They talked for hours that night, drinking cider by the fire. Silas told stories of the mountains beyond the colony, places where the rivers were silver and the ground glowed in the moonlight. He spoke of strange lights seen over the hills and of a tribe that worshipped the wind. Elijah listened in silence, unsure whether to believe him or not. But even if half the stories were lies, they filled the night with wonder. Before Silas left, he said something Elijah would never forget. "This land," he said quietly, staring into the fire, "it remembers everyone who walks it. It gives, it takes, and sometimes it tests you. But if you listen close enough, you'll hear it talking back." Elijah didn't understand what he meant then. But as the weeks went by and the world grew colder, he began to realize that perhaps the trapper was right. The land wasn't just a place, it was alive. It held every sound, every story, every heartbeat of those who dared to call it home. And though he couldn't yet see it, the land was about to test him in ways he could never imagine. As the months passed, Elijah began to know every corner of Norfield. The way the dirt road curved past the well, the sound the church bell made when the wind came from the east, even the way the morning light touched the tops of the cabins before spilling across the fields. The village wasn't large, perhaps 30 souls in total, but each person carried a story of their own, as if every face was a chapter of a book written by hardship and hope. The blacksmith, Mr. Tully, was a man built like the anvil he worked on, broad shoulders, hands blackened by soot. When he spoke, sparks seemed to fall from his voice. His forge never slept, not even in winter, and children often lingered near the doorway just to feel its warmth. His wife, Martha, baked the bread everyone depended on when their own flour ran low. She'd laugh and say, if God made hunger, he surely made ovens to fight it. Then there was Abigail Moore, the widow who made candles. Her small house always smelled of beeswax and smoke. By day, she sold candles for pennies. By night, she whispered prayers for the husband she lost to fever years before. She was quiet, but sometimes when the moon was full, you could hear her humming a strange, wordless tune through the open window. The villagers said it was a song from her childhood, though others swore it was a hymn for the dead. Every Saturday, people gathered at the square for trading. There was no real market, just wooden tables, baskets, and laughter. A man might trade 2 chickens for a bolt of cloth, or a few jars of honey for a spool of thread. Coins were rare, and no one really missed them. Here, value was measured not in silver, but in usefulness. If it kept you warm, fed, or safe, it was worth more than gold. The preacher, Reverend Elias, was a thin, nervous man whose sermons were more fire than comfort. He believed the wilderness was both gift and punishment, a place where a man's soul was tested by temptation and loneliness. Sin hides behind every tree, he often said, his voice trembling with conviction. But when the church filled with candlelight on Sunday mornings, and the sound of hymns drifted through the open door, even Elijah, who wasn't much for religion, felt something close to peace. There were small joys, too. When spring came, the village came alive with music. Fiddles, laughter, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. People danced barefoot in the grass, their worries forgotten for one night. Even Elijah, usually quiet and reserved, found himself smiling as he watched the children twirl under lanterns hung from the trees. It was in those moments he felt that Norfield wasn't just a place to survive, it was a place to live. But life had a rhythm of shadow as well as light. Every now and then, someone would vanish. Sometimes a trapper who went too far into the woods and never came back. Sometimes a traveler on the road, last seen walking toward the hills. The villagers didn't speak of it much, but their eyes told the story. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it also swallowed people whole. And the silence it left behind was heavy. Elijah began to notice things. Small things. A trail of footprints that stopped suddenly near the creek. The sound of knocking on his cabin wall at night, when no one was there. Once, while walking to the well before dawn, he saw a figure standing among the trees, a tall shadow that didn't move, even when the wind did. When he blinked, it was gone. He told himself it was nothing, just the tricks of moonlight and tired eyes. But deep down, he wondered. Still, the village moved forward, as it always did. Each day brought its small victories, a roof mended, a child born, a harvest saved from frost. People laughed easily, cried quietly, and went on living. That was the way of things in the 1700s. Life didn't pause for grief or fear, it simply kept walking. One evening, as Elijah was returning from the forest with a bundle of wood, he saw a boy sitting alone by the river. It was Samuel, the preacher's son, a thin, curious child of 10. He was staring at the water, whispering something. Elijah asked what he was doing, and the boy looked up with wide eyes. "I'm talking to the river," he said. Elijah chuckled. "And what does it say back?" The boy hesitated. "It says, it remembers everyone who's fallen in." The words made Elijah shiver. He wanted to laugh it off, but the boy's tone was too calm, too certain. Later that night, Elijah asked Reverend Elias about it. The preacher frowned and said Samuel had been dreaming strange things lately, voices in the wind, faces in the firelight. "He's just a child," the reverend said. "Children see what we cannot." That night, Elijah sat by his fire for a long time, staring at the flames as they danced across the walls. He thought of Silas, the trapper, and what he'd said, that the land remembers everyone who walks it. Perhaps, Elijah thought, some memories never fade. They just wait. The next morning, life went on as if nothing had changed. The sun rose over the fields, the roosters crowed, and smoke curled once more from the chimneys of Norfield. But deep in the forest, unseen and unheard, something ancient was stirring. And soon, the people of Norfield would feel it. Faith was the backbone of Norfield, though it wasn't always the gentle kind. It was heavy, carved from fear as much as devotion. In those days, God was not a comfort. He was a ruler stern and watchful, weighing every man's soul with cold precision. People prayed not just to be blessed, but to be spared, from sickness, from hunger, from whatever shadows waited in the dark corners of the world. Every Sunday, the church bell echoed through the valley, its hollow tone rolling over the trees like a warning. Men came in their best shirts, women in plain dresses with white bonnets. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and candle wax. The windows were small, and the light that slipped through them fell like thin, pale fingers across the pews. When Reverend Elias spoke, no one dared move. His sermons were long, his voice sharp as an axe. He spoke of sin and salvation, of fire and forgiveness, but mostly of fear of losing one's soul to temptation. "Elijah," he once said, fixing him with those restless eyes, "the devil works in quiet places. He doesn't come with thunder. He comes with whispers." Elijah nodded politely, but said nothing. He wasn't sure he believed in devils or witches or ghosts, though everyone else did. In a world without science or certainty, Belief filled every empty space. If a cow fell ill, it was a curse. If the crops failed, someone had angered God. People whispered prayers under their breath as they passed the woods, dropped coins into wells, and marked their doorways with bits of salt. The widow Abigail was known for her charms, little bundles of twine and herbs that she tied above door frames. She claimed they kept nightmares away. Some swore they worked, others said she dabbled in witchcraft. No one confronted her, though. Not after the last time. Years before Elijah arrived, there had been an accusation, a farmer's wife named Mary Hale. The story was whispered in fragments, but everyone knew how it ended. A fever swept through the town, taking several children. Desperate for reason, people pointed fingers. They said Mary had been seen talking to herself near the well, that she kept strange symbols carved into her walls. One night, a mob gathered with torches. By dawn, Mary's house was gone, burned to ash, and her name was never spoken again. Elijah had found a piece of scorched stone near the forest line his first winter. He didn't know it then, but it had once been part of Mary's chimney. Sometimes he still wondered if the whispers were true, or if fear itself was the real witch that haunted Norfield. Even the preacher's son, little Samuel, seemed touched by strange things. He'd been found once near the graveyard, drawing circles in the dirt with a stick, muttering something no one could understand. Reverend Elias tried to discipline him, but the boy's eyes, dark, distant, made even his father pause. Abigail once said softly, "The boy sees more than he should." At night, the world seemed to breathe differently. The forest groaned in the wind, the river hummed beneath the ice, and the stars hung motionless like watchful eyes. Inside their homes, people whispered before bed. "Keep the fire alive," they'd say. "The dark listens." Elijah didn't like to admit it, but he'd started keeping his own small habits. A coin on the windowsill, a sprig of rosemary above the door. Not because he believed, but because everyone else did. There was comfort in joining the rhythm of fear. It made the nights seem shorter. One evening, as he returned from helping Tully repair his roof, Elijah passed by the church and saw a faint light inside. The door was half open, creaking softly in the wind. Curious, he stepped closer. The candles were still burning on the altar, though no one was there. He called out for Reverend Elias, but his voice echoed back unanswered. As he turned to leave, he noticed something on the floor, marks scratched into the wood beneath the pews. Circles and lines, drawn roughly by hand. They looked like symbols, though he didn't recognize them. Kneeling down, he traced one with his finger. It was still fresh, carved recently. Then from the far corner, came the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Elijah's chest tightened. "Reverend," he called again. No answer. When he turned toward the sound, the candles flickered violently, their flames stretching tall and thin. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing in the doorway, small, almost childlike. Then the wind slammed the door shut, and the room fell into darkness. The next morning, the church stood silent. Reverend Elias acted as though nothing had happened. Elijah tried to ask about the marks, but the preacher only said, "Best not to look for signs where none are meant to be seen." And yet, that night, Elijah couldn't sleep. The forest outside seemed to whisper his name again and again. He told himself it was only the wind, but deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. The faith of Norfield was built on fear. But sometimes, Elijah wondered if what they feared most wasn't the devil at all, but the land itself. The year turned cold faster than anyone expected. By late October, the frost had crept in through the cracks of the cabin walls, biting at my fingers as I split logs by the river. The sky seemed lower than before, gray and swollen with snow, and every sound in the forest felt muted, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Life in the colonies had never been easy, but that winter, That winter tested the patience of even the most stubborn souls. The harvest had been small. Corn didn't grow well that year. Too much rain in the summer, too little sun. Our food stores were thin, and my mother spent long nights by the hearth, drying strips of venison and saving every crumb of bread. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and see her staring into the fire, whispering prayers under her breath. She wasn't the only one worried. Even the blacksmith, who never stopped talking, had gone quiet these past few weeks. The river froze, solid by November. You could walk across it to the other side and not hear a single crack. My friend Thomas and I used to skate on it when we were younger, or at least try to, slipping and laughing as our boots slid out from under us. But now, no one went near it. The air was too still, and even the wolves that howled at night seemed to keep their distance. There was something strange about that winter, a heaviness that wasn't just from the cold. Rumors began to spread, carried on the wind like sparks from a dying fire. Some said there were soldiers marching in the north, red-coated men under the king's flag, moving closer to Boston. Others whispered about uprisings, farmers refusing to pay their taxes, taverns filled with angry talk about freedom and tyranny. I was just a boy, but even I could feel it. Something was shifting beneath the quiet surface of life. The air was charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. One night, as the snow fell in thick white sheets outside, my father sat me down by the fire. He looked tired, older somehow, though the light made his face seem soft. "Elias," he said slowly, "there's talk in town of things changing. Men are meeting in secret, talking about standing up to the king's men. If it comes to that, there'll be fighting." I didn't know what to say. I'd never seen a war, never heard a gun fired in anger. To me, the world had always been the same, small, familiar, filled with the sounds of hammers, horses, and the wind through the trees. The thought of it changing scared me. "Will you fight, Father?" I asked. He looked at the fire for a long time before answering. "If I must." A man can only be pushed so far before he remembers he's free. Those words stayed with me for years. At the time, I didn't understand their weight. But later I would, when the drums began to echo down the valleys, when the quiet towns of the colonies awoke like a sleeping beast. That winter, we spent our days surviving. We chopped wood until our hands bled, patched the roof with whatever scraps we could find, and melted snow for water. Every morning, I'd check the traps by the edge of the woods, hoping for a rabbit or a squirrel, anything to add to our stew. Some days I found nothing. Other days, I found tracks that weren't animal at all, boot prints, half covered by snow, leading toward the road to town. Once, near the end of December, I followed a set of prints deeper into the woods than I ever had before. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The snow reached my knees, and the trees creaked like old bones. And there, between two oaks, I found something strange, a torn scrap of red cloth caught on a branch. I held it for a long moment before tucking it into my coat and heading home. I didn't tell my father. The days grew darker, the nights longer. By the time the new year came, the whispers had turned into certainty. The colonies were changing, the world itself was changing, but we didn't yet know how much it would demand from us. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl outside, I had the strangest feeling that someone, was watching from the edge of the forest. Not an animal. Something else. That was the first night I dreamed of fire. When the snow finally began to melt, it did not bring the joy it used to. The sound of dripping water from the rooftops was mixed with something else, a tension that hung in the air, thicker than the fog rising from the river. The roads turned to mud, the wagons sank deep into it, and the world smelled of damp wood and unease. Men came through the village now, men we didn't recognize. They rode on tired horses, wearing worn coats and tricorn hats dusted with frost. Some said they were messengers from the north, Others swore they were spies. They never stayed long, only stopped at the tavern, spoke in low voices, and then vanished again into the hills. I remember watching them from behind the fence, their silhouettes fading into the mist. One morning, Father came back from town later than usual. His face was pale, and his hands shook when he took off his gloves. "They fired shots," he said quietly. "In Massachusetts. The king's soldiers and the colonists. It's begun." I didn't understand it right away. Begun? I asked. "The war," he whispered. "It's here." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mother stopped stirring the pot. My little sister didn't know what it meant, but she looked at us and began to cry anyway. In the following days, everything seemed to move faster. The quiet routine of our lives, chopping wood, tending to the animals, mending the roof, was replaced by something else entirely. Father spent his nights in the barn with other men, whispering and making lists. They carried papers, sealed letters, and sometimes muskets wrapped in cloth. I wasn't supposed to see any of it, but I did. Once, I followed Father into the woods after dark. The moonlight shone silver on the frozen ground. I kept my distance, stepping carefully so the leaves wouldn't betray me. They met by the old mill, 5 men, all from our village, their faces drawn tight with fear and determination. They spoke of Lexington and Concord, of men who had stood their ground, of freedom and sacrifice. The words sounded strange to me, too big for the world I knew. When they left, I saw my father kneel in the snow. He pressed his hand against the earth and stayed there for a long time. I think in that moment he was saying goodbye, not to us but to the life we'd known. As spring came, the war crept closer. We began hearing distant booms, faint but steady, like thunder rolling across the sky. Travelers brought stories: British ships off the coast, towns burned, farms taken. Some of the men from our village never returned from their meetings. Others came back limping, or not at all. I remember one afternoon when I was gathering water by the stream. The air was still, the sky gray. Then I heard it, drums. Faint, rhythmic, echoing through the trees. At first, I thought it was thunder again, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, steadier. I dropped the bucket and ran home. Mother was at the window when I burst through the door. "They're coming," she said quietly. We stood on the porch, staring down the road. Dust rose in the distance, a column of soldiers, their coats bright red against the dull earth. They marched in silence except for the steady beat of the drums. British troops. The king's men. They didn't look like men from a story, not brave knights or monsters. Just tired faces beneath heavy hats, eyes scanning every house as they passed. When they reached our fence, one of them stopped and looked right at me. He was young, maybe not much older than I was. His face was thin, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the strap of his musket. For a moment, our eyes met. And then he moved on. After they were gone, everything felt empty. The sound of their boots still echoed in my chest. That night, Father packed a small bag. Mother didn't say a word, but I could see her jaw tighten. He looked at me before leaving. "Take care of them," he said. "Whatever happens, don't be afraid." And then he was gone. The days that followed were long and quiet. Every creak of the door, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. There were no letters, no word from the men. Only the sound of distant thunder that never seemed to stop. Sometimes, when I went to fetch wood, I would find musket balls buried in the mud. Once, I found a torn piece of blue fabric, the kind the local militia wore. I didn't pick it up. That spring, I learned what fear really was. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that settles deep in your chest and never lets go. And somewhere far away, beyond the hills and the smoke, history was being written, and we were all caught in its ink. At first, there were just rumors that the king's soldiers had taken food from the farms to the east, that rebels had burned a supply wagon near the coast. Then, people began to disappear. It started with the neighbors, the Carters, who lived just over the hill. One morning, their house stood silent, the door swinging open in the wind. Inside, the hearth was cold, the chairs knocked over, and the floor covered in muddy footprints. No one ever saw them again. By summer, the roads were empty. No children played by the river, no laughter echoed through the fields. Only the crows remained, circling above the abandoned farms, calling out into the heavy, humid air. Sometimes I thought the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Mother tried to keep us busy. We still had to plant, still had to cook, still had to live. But every sound made her jump now, the creak of the floorboards, the crack of a branch outside. She would glance at the window and whisper, "Stay inside." I didn't argue. Food grew scarce. Without father and the other men, the fields were harder to tend. Some nights we'd hear distant shouts, gunfire maybe, or something worse, echoing across the valley. When the wind blew right, it carried the faint scent of smoke. I began to realize how close the war really was. It wasn't just in the stories or the rumors anymore. It was here, somewhere beyond the trees. One afternoon, I went to fetch water from the well near the Carter's place. The air was heavy and still, the sky pale like ash. When I reached their farm, I noticed something strange, the sound of movement inside the house. I froze. The door creaked open, and for a heartbeat, I thought it was them, that maybe they had come home. But then a man stepped out. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt, his hands shaking as he held a musket. He wasn't one of ours. His accent was thick, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. A British deserter, maybe, or a starving rebel. We stared at each other for a moment, both too tired to be afraid. Finally, he lowered the gun and muttered something I couldn't understand. Then he stumbled past me and disappeared into the woods. I stood there, listening to the sound of his boots fading into silence. That night, I told Mother what I'd seen. She didn't seem surprised. "There'll be more," she said softly. "Hungry men, lost men. War takes more than it gives." She was right. Within weeks, the soldiers came through again, not marching this time, but scattered, worn, hollow-eyed. They knocked on doors, demanding food, water, shelter. Those who refused, well, people whispered about what happened, but no one spoke of it aloud. One evening, I saw smoke rising from the ridge. 3 plumes, tall and dark. It wasn't from a chimney. It was from houses. The wind carried the smell of burning wood and something worse. That night, the horizon glowed red. After that, Mother stopped lighting candles at night. She said it was safer to live in darkness. We learned to move quietly, to keep the windows covered, to sleep with one ear open. The nights grew longer again, though it was summer. The forest around us was alive with strange sounds, voices, whispers, cries that faded before I could tell if they were real. And then one night, I woke to knocking. Not gentle knocking, hard, desperate pounding on the door. Mother froze beside me. The knocking came again, louder this time. She handed me my sister and whispered, "Stay here." I listened from the corner as she opened the door. A voice spoke, a man's voice, hoarse and trembling. "Please, food, just a little." She hesitated, then gave him something from the table, bread, I think. I heard him whisper something before he left. I couldn't make out the words, but I thought I heard "God bless you." When she closed the door, I asked, "Who was it?" She just shook her head. "A man who's lost," she said. The war had turned everyone into someone lost. Weeks passed. The noise of distant guns grew louder, then faded again. The crops struggled. The river ran low. I started to forget what peace had sounded like. Sometimes, at night, I'd climb the hill behind our house and look toward the horizon. Far away, beyond the trees and the smoke, I could see flashes of light, faint, like lightning. But I knew it wasn't a storm. It was the world tearing itself apart. And in the quiet between the booms, when the air stood still, I could almost hear something else, a whisper carried by the wind, saying that the old world was gone, and something new was coming. But none of us yet knew what it would cost. By the time I turned 16, the war had already stolen more years than I could count. The fields where I once chased fireflies were now overgrown with weeds and silence. The laughter that used to echo from a tavern on summer nights was gone, replaced by the distant rumble of cannon fire and the uneasy quiet that followed. Father had not returned. For a long time, I believed he would. Every sunset, I watched the road that wound through the valley, half expecting to see his shape in the distance, a shadow carrying the weight of his musket, walking home. But the road stayed empty. Only crows came that way now. The world had changed. Everyone could feel it. The war had carved through the land like a storm, tearing families apart, scattering men across forests and fields. Some fought for the king, others for the colonies, and many, like us, just fought to survive. Mother grew thinner that year. Her hair had turned the color of winter frost, though she wasn't old. My sister no longer played by the fire. She just sat there, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. It was as if the war had seeped into the walls of our home, whispering through the cracks, waiting for the day it could take what little we had left. One morning, I woke to the sound of gunfire, close this time. Not far off thunder, but sharp cracking shots that echoed through the valley. I grabbed my coat and ran outside. The sky was pale and heavy with smoke drifting from the hills. Then I saw them. Men, maybe 20, maybe more, stumbling down the road toward the river. Some in blue, some in tattered red, their uniforms torn and stained. They looked less like soldiers and more like ghosts. A few carried muskets. Most didn't. Some limped, some crawled. And behind them, the faint shimmer of heat rising from something burning. I hid behind a fallen fence, heart pounding. One man passed close enough for me to see the dirt caked on his face, the blood on his sleeve. He looked at me for just a moment, eyes hollow, expressionless, and then kept walking. When they were gone, I followed the smoke up the hill. What I saw there will never leave me. The Carter farm, what was left of it, burned quietly, the flames licking through what used to be walls. The barn was gone. The field was scattered with the shapes of men who would never move again. A cannon wheel lay half buried in the mud, split clean in two. The air smelled of ash and iron and something else, something bitter. It was the first time I truly saw what war looked like. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move. The world was quiet except for the crackle of fire and the cawing of distant crows. I didn't cry. I couldn't. There was nothing left to cry for. When I returned home, I didn't tell Mother what I had seen. She didn't ask. But I think she already knew. From that day on, I stopped waiting for Father. Weeks passed. The smoke on the horizon never really faded. Soldiers, from both sides, came and went. Some demanded food. Some just stared at us with empty eyes. I learned to speak carefully, to nod when they asked questions, to hide what little we had. One evening, a man in a blue coat came to our door. He was wounded, his sleeve torn, blood seeping through the fabric. He asked for shelter. Mother hesitated only a moment before letting him in. His name was Samuel, and he was younger than I expected, barely 20. He stayed with us for 2 days, sleeping by the fire. He spoke softly, his voice rough from smoke and hunger. He told us that the war had spread like wildfire, that even the mighty cities of the coast were crumbling. That freedom, he said, was being written in blood and smoke. Before he left, he gave me something, a small tarnished button from his coat. "Keep it," he said, "to remember what all this was for." I still have it. Sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I hold it in my hand and wonder if he ever made it home. That autumn, the forests began to change again, the leaves turning red, then brown, then falling like old memories. The war had been raging for years, but for the first time, I began to wonder what would come after it. Would there even be an after? The world I knew was gone. The farms, the people, the laughter, all turned to dust and echoes. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the ash and ruin, a small part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, there was something left worth rebuilding. And as I looked out across the valley that evening, the same valley I'd known since childhood, I could feel it, the faintest tremor beneath the earth, like the heartbeat of a world trying to live again. The morning I left home, the sky was the color of old pewter, dull, quiet, heavy. I remember standing by the doorway, staring out at the field where the frost still clung to the grass. My pack was light, barely enough for a few days, a loaf of bread, a flask of water, and the old knife Father had left behind. Mother didn't say much. She stood by the fire, her hands folded, her face half hidden by the shadows. My sister clung to her skirt, watching me with wide, tired eyes. "You don't have to go," Mother said softly, though I could hear in her voice that she already knew I would. "I do," I answered. "If Father's still out there, someone has to find him." She nodded once, slowly, and pressed something into my palm, a small wooden cross, carved rough and simple. "Then may this bring you back," she said. I slipped it into my pocket, and without another word, stepped out into the cold. The world beyond our valley felt strange, like walking through a dream half remembered. The forests I had known since childhood now seemed darker, the trees taller and closer together. The roads were rutted, scarred by wagon wheels and boots. Every mile carried the ghost of something that had passed through, soldiers, refugees, or worse. By the second day, I reached the next village, or what was left of it. Half the houses had burned, their chimneys standing like broken teeth against the gray sky. The church bell hung cracked and silent. A single dog wandered between the ruins, ribs showing through its fur. I found an old man sitting by the well, wrapped in a coat that looked too big for him. He stared at the horizon as if waiting for something that would never come. "Did any soldiers pass this way?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "They all do," he said. "And none of them come back." That night, I slept in what used to be a tavern. The wind howled through the cracks in the roof, and the smell of burnt wood still lingered in the air. I dreamed of Father, standing in the doorway of our house, his face hidden by smoke. I tried to reach him, but every time I did, he stepped back into the fire. By the third day, I followed the river south. The water ran dark and fast, carrying with it bits of broken wood, a shoe, a child's doll. I tried not to think about where they had come from. Along the bank, I saw the first bodies, soldiers, half buried in the mud, their uniforms torn. Some wore red, some blue. All the same in the end. Or didn't care what color you wore. In the afternoon, I met a small group of men gathered around a dying fire. They looked rough, farmers turned fighters, their coats patched with scraps of whatever fabric they could find. One of them called out as I approached, raising his musket. "Name yourself." "Elias," I said, "from the northern valley." They lowered their weapons slowly. The oldest among them, a man with a scar down his cheek, studied me for a long time. "You're young," he said. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for my father. He joined the militia. At that, the man's expression softened. He gestured for me to sit. "You won't find him out here, boy," he said quietly. "The lines keep moving. No one knows where the front is anymore." They shared their food with me, hard bread and a bit of salted pork, and told me what they knew. Battles that lasted for days. Villages burned to deny the enemy shelter. Men deserting, others vanishing into the forests. They spoke of hope too, though it sounded fragile, like something they were afraid to hold onto too tightly. Before I left, the scarred man gave me a warning. "If you keep walking south, you'll reach the camps near Trenton. But keep your head low. There are patrols everywhere, and they shoot first, ask later." I thanked him and moved on. The next few days blurred together, long stretches of road, endless cold, the constant hum of fear in my chest. Once I saw a farmhouse flying a tattered flag, 13 stars on a field of blue. For a moment, I stopped and stared at it fluttering in the wind. It looked so small, so fragile, against the vast gray sky. That night, I camped beneath an oak tree. The stars were faint, barely visible through the smoke that still hung in the air from somewhere far away. I took out the button Samuel had given me and turned it over in my hand. The metal was cold, but somehow it steadied me. I thought of home, of mother by the fire, of my sister's small laugh before the war, of father's words. "A man can only be pushed so far before he remembers he's free." And as I fell asleep beneath the whispering branches, I realized that I wasn't just looking for him anymore. I was looking for the America he had believed in. By the time I reached the outskirts of the rebel camp, the sun had dropped low, staining the sky in dull shades of amber and gray. Smoke curled from a dozen small fires, each surrounded by men and boys, some barely older than me. Their faces were smeared with dirt and ash, their eyes sharp and wary, as if the world itself had taught them to trust nothing. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure if I should approach. Then I remembered the button Samuel had given me, the one I still carried in my pocket. It was small, tarnished, but it felt like a compass pointing me toward something, maybe safety, maybe purpose. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The first man to notice me was young, barely 16, with a shock of dark hair falling over his forehead. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "I'm Elias," I said. "I came from the northern valley. I'm looking for my father." He joined your side." The boy's eyes flickered, uncertain. He motioned for me to stay put, then ran to a man with a scarred cheek, older, taller, and broader than anyone I had ever seen. The man examined me silently, squinting against the setting sun. "Another boy," he muttered. "What do you think you'll do out here alone?" I can help," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You can stay, but keep your hands where I can see them." I followed him into the camp, passing rows of tents made from canvas and patched cloth. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with the scent of mud and unwashed bodies. Men sharpened bayonets. Others patched their clothing with whatever scraps they could find. There was no glory here, no clean uniforms, no sense of pride beyond survival. At the center of the camp, I saw a group of men huddled around a fire, talking in low voices. Some laughed. The sound was rough, forced, almost hollow. Others stared into the flames, lost in thoughts I could not guess. I realized quickly that war wasn't a parade of heroes. It was cold nights, hunger, fear, and long days filled with waiting. One man approached me, older than the rest, his face lined and burned by sun and wind. "You're far from home, boy," he said quietly. "You can't be here for glory. If that's what you're looking for, turn around. The king's men will teach you what it means to be a man faster than you want." "I'm looking for my father," I said. Do you know him? He frowned. Many men have passed through here. Names are hard to keep straight. But maybe you'll find him in the coming days. Maybe not. The war doesn't care who's missing. I watched the camp through the night. Soldiers taking turns keeping watch. Others asleep on the ground with blankets or coats that offered little warmth. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows across the tents. I saw a boy barely older than I was try to light a musket and fumble so badly that the powder almost spilled across the dirt. A man cursed and pulled him aside. Mistakes, I realized, were expensive, sometimes deadly. The longer I stayed, the more I understood that life here was survival, not heroism. There was laughter, yes, but it was brittle, fleeting. There was camaraderie, but it was always tinged with the fear that any man could vanish in a night, or wake to find his friend dead beside him. At one of the fires, I met Samuel again, the man who had stayed with us months before. He looked older, thinner, hardened by what he'd seen. He nodded at me silently, eyes wary. War changes everything, he said. The land, the people, even the boys who think they're men. You'll learn that soon enough. That night, as the wind cut through the tents and the fires hissed with the smoke of wet wood, I realized something. I had come searching for my father, for a dream of freedom I barely understood. But the truth was heavier than I could have imagined. Freedom, I saw now, wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It smelled of mud, blood, and fear. And yet, despite everything, I stayed. Because sometimes, the world demands you follow the path before you even know where it leads. The first time I saw battle, it was nothing like the stories I had imagined. There were no sweeping banners, no heroic speeches, no orderly lines of men advancing with courage blazing in their eyes. There was only chaos, mud, and the sharp, bitter smell of smoke and blood. We had been marching for days along a narrow road lined with trees, the sun hidden behind a thick gray sky. The air was damp, cold seeping through every layer of clothing I had. The men around me were quiet, their eyes scanning the forest edges, muscles tense, every finger brushing the trigger of a musket or the hilt of a knife. Even the veterans moved cautiously. Their steps were measured, haunted by the knowledge that any misstep could mean death. Then it happened. A sudden crack from the trees. A shot fired too close to ignore. A shout. Another shot. The men around me broke into motion, yelling, reloading, firing. I froze at first, unable to think, my heart hammering so hard it felt as if it would burst through my chest. A soldier in red appeared through the fog of smoke and dust. He didn't look much older than me. He raised his musket, and for a split second, our eyes met. I raised my rifle too, though my hands shook violently. Then the world erupted into noise. The shot fired. The man fell. I remember the way the sunlight caught his eyes for a fleeting moment before they glazed over. I fell to my knees, stomach twisting, unable to breathe. Around me, the men shouted, cursed, and fired. The ground was churned with mud, scattered with leaves, twigs, and bodies. I heard a scream to my left and turned to see a friend from the camp clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. He tried to stand, to reload, but fell again. Every instinct told me to run, to hide, to disappear into the forest. But something inside me, something Father had said once, something Samuel had warned me about, kept me rooted. Survival wasn't just running. Sometimes it was standing through fear you could barely name. I remember the sound most of all. The crack of muskets, the scream of men, the thud of bodies hitting the dirt, and the terrible silence in the fractions of seconds between shots. It was a rhythm cruel and relentless that made my head spin. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred. The smoke thickened, and the forest around us seemed to close in, as if it wanted to swallow the living and the dead alike. By the time the shooting stopped, I was shaking, my clothes soaked in sweat and mud. Around me, some men were tending to the wounded. Others wandered, dazed, staring at the ground. The dead lay in strange, twisted positions, some covered with blankets, others not. I stepped over a body to reach Samuel. He was crouched beside another man, trying to staunch the bleeding from a deep wound in his leg. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw fear on his face, raw, unhidden. "You all right, boy?" he asked. I think so," I whispered. He shook his head. "No one's all right. Not after this." That night, we camped near the edge of the woods. Fires burned low, men whispered in corners, and the moans of the wounded drifted across the clearing. I couldn't sleep. Every crack in the trees, every rustle in the brush made my heart leap. I kept thinking of the red-coated soldier I had seen fall, how young he was, how close we were to being on opposite sides, and how easily life could end in this war. In the morning, the road was littered with remnants of battle, broken muskets, discarded shoes, bits of cloth, and the scent of iron and smoke. I learned to recognize the signs quickly: footprints of retreat, torn flags, the flattened grass where men had fallen. For the first time, I understood that war wasn't an abstract idea. It was real. It was close. It was terrifying. And most of all, it didn't care who you were, where you came from, or how brave you thought you were. And yet, despite the fear, despite the mud and blood, despite the aching in every muscle, I remained. Because the alternative, hiding forever, running from the world, was no longer an option. The war had changed me. It had stolen my innocence, replaced it with a strange, cold knowledge. Survival is measured not in courage, but in endurance. In the weeks that followed our first clash, life in the rebel camp settled into a rhythm, though it was nothing like the peaceful routine I had once known. There were no clear mornings or calm evenings, only cycles of preparation, skirmishes, and the ever-present tension that gnawed at every waking moment. I learned quickly that survival wasn't about heroism. It was about paying attention to the small things. Watching the wind, listening to distant sounds, keeping your powder dry, and knowing which friends might not wake in the morning. I trained under Samuel's watchful eye. He was patient but strict, correcting my aim, my stance, even the way I loaded my musket. "You'll kill no one if you can't do the basics," he said. "And worse, you'll get yourself killed." At first, the task seemed endless: marching, drilling, lifting heavy packs, running along muddy trails with full gear. But slowly, muscle memory took over, fear dulled into sharp awareness, and I began to understand the rhythm of battle. Yet knowledge did not make it easier. I watched men I had eaten beside, laughed beside, and trained beside fall to musket fire or cannonballs. Some were boys like me, their eyes wide with disbelief the first time they saw blood. Others were older, hardened men, whose grim expressions could not hide the fear simmering beneath. Each loss left a hollow ache inside, a weight that grew heavier with every passing day. One morning, a young man named Peter, barely 17, stumbled back from a skirmish along the riverbank. He had been shot in the shoulder, and his uniform was torn and soaked in blood. He trembled as he recounted how his unit had been ambushed, how friends had fallen beside him, how screams had filled the air. Samuel patched him up, muttering curses under his breath, while I sat silently, staring at the dirt. The images lingered long after Peter had drifted into uneasy sleep. Conversations around the fires were often punctuated by the same realization: the line between right and wrong blurred. One night, a debate flared among the men about whether it was acceptable to raid a loyalist farmer for food. Some argued it was necessary for survival. Others swore it was dishonorable, that taking from neighbors, even those loyal to the king, was wrong. I listened, torn, unable to answer. I had never imagined morality could feel so heavy, so complicated. Hunger became another teacher. Rations were meager, stretched thin to last the marching columns. Cornmeal porridge, salted pork, and the occasional rabbit or squirrel scavenged from the woods. We ate quickly, quietly, never forgetting the moments when supply wagons were ambushed or farms burned before our eyes. Even in moments of brief laughter, a man's stomach growled with reminders of the hunger gnawing inside, and the silence between bites often held more weight than conversation. In time, I began to notice how the war had changed us all. Eyes grew sharper, movements quicker, expressions harder. Laughter became rare, smiles fleeting. Even Samuel, usually so composed, carried a shadow I could feel in his presence. He would disappear into the woods for hours after battle, returning only at dusk, shoulders slumped, silence etched across his face. I knew he carried ghosts I could not name. And yet, amidst the exhaustion and fear, there were moments of strange beauty. Dawn over the hills could look almost peaceful, the smoke from distant skirmishes curling like mist over the trees. A quiet river in early spring reflected the pink sky, untouched by war. The men sometimes sang as they worked, low voices blending with the wind through the branches. It reminded me that life persisted even here, in the mud, the blood, and the fire. By the end of that season, I had learned something essential. War was not a tale of heroism. It was a lesson in endurance, morality, and resilience. The boy who had left home months before, naive and hopeful, was gone. In his place stood someone shaped by fear and blood, by uncertainty and the small victories that came with surviving each day. And I realized, perhaps the most frightening truth of all, that the world outside our valley, the one I had thought I understood, had changed forever. The war was no longer distant. It had become my life. By the time autumn settled over the hills, the camp had grown larger, though no less haunted. Tents were stretched over every clearing, fires burned constantly, and the constant murmur of anxious voices filled the night. The forest around us had changed too, leaves turning brittle, branches snapping under the weight of snow that hadn't yet come, shadows stretching long and dark over the muddy ground. It was in this uneasy quiet that the first major loss struck us. A scouting party of 10 men, sent to gather intelligence on a nearby loyalist garrison, never returned. Days passed before the word reached camp. Ambushed, some killed outright, others captured. Their absence left a vacuum that stretched across the camp like a shadow, and the rest of us moved a little slower, spoke a little softer, stared at each other with heavier eyes. Samuel was among those who had known the missing men best. He didn't speak much that night, just paced beside the fire, occasionally staring into the darkness as if trying to will them back. I watched him, the weight of unspoken words settling in my chest. War had begun to carve lines in our souls, lines that could not be erased. In the days that followed, tensions flared. Scarce rations and frayed nerves made small disagreements explode into loud arguments. One evening, near the cook fire, 2 men nearly came to blows over a handful of salted pork. Another time, someone accused a neighbor of hoarding ammunition. Each conflict, though brief, reminded us all that survival was not just a struggle against the enemy, but against ourselves, against fear and hunger and mistrust. I found myself questioning why we were here, what we were really fighting for. At first, I had imagined freedom, heroism, and honor, but the reality was different. We were men and boys hardened by cold, mud, and blood, chasing ideals that sometimes felt like smoke slipping through our fingers. Every day brought new evidence that war was less about virtue and more about endurance. One night, I wandered to the edge of the camp alone, drawn by the thin moonlight spilling over the trees. The forest was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant howl. I sat against a tree, taking in the camp from afar. Fires flickered, shadows danced, and the men moved like ghosts between tents, each step measured, cautious, wary. I realized how fragile life had become. A single wrong move, one careless glance, and it could all end. Samuel found me there, leaning against the tree, eyes heavy with thought. "You've seen enough to understand," he said softly. "The war isn't clean. It isn't noble. You think about ideals, but they are hard to hold when the cold bites your bones and the mud swallows your feet. And still, we must keep moving forward." I didn't answer. I just nodded, understanding though not fully. The words rang true, yet they offered little comfort. Survival had become a complex calculus, every choice weighed against fear, hunger, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Over the following days, I witnessed more losses. Men I had trained with, laughed with, and depended on were killed by musket fire, disease, or accidents in the chaos of movement. The camp grew quieter, more subdued. Jokes became rarer, and when they appeared, they were hollow, fleeting attempts to mask exhaustion. And yet, in the middle of despair, there were moments that reminded us why we persisted. Sometimes a lull in the fighting, a clear night sky, the sound of a stream nearby. Small things that made the mud, the blood, and the fear seem momentarily distant. They reminded me that we were alive, fragile as it was, and that in itself was enough to keep going. I began to understand that war demanded something more than courage or skill. It demanded endurance, patience, and a willingness to see both friends and enemies as shadows in the same world, all trying to survive in the same mud, the same cold, the same relentless tide of history. And I realized slowly that every man lost, every argument, every night spent shivering beside a fire in the dark, was carving something into me that would remain long after the war ended. The understanding that survival comes with a cost, and that cost is often heavier than the ideals we fight for. Winter had not yet arrived, but the cold was biting, seeping into every layer of clothing and every bone in my body. The camp was tense, men moving with quiet urgency, preparing for what Samuel called the inevitable clash. Rumors had spread of a large force of Redcoats moving through the countryside, burning towns, taking supplies, and leaving fear in their wake. We marched at dawn, the ground hard and frozen beneath our boots. Every man carried his musket, a pack of supplies, and the invisible weight of knowing that this battle would not be like the skirmishes we had grown accustomed to. The farther we went, the more signs of destruction appeared, smoke rising over distant hills, charred remains of homes, abandoned farms with livestock wandering aimlessly, and the occasional lifeless body sprawled in the mud. I saw a mother clutching her child by the side of the road, her eyes wide with terror. She whispered prayers I could not hear, shivering as the wind tore through her thin cloak. Behind her, the remnants of her home smoldered, a stark reminder that war did not spare the innocent. By midday, the Redcoats appeared on the horizon, a line of bright red against the dull winter sky. Their march was precise, disciplined, terrifying in its order. I had trained for this, but training did not prepare anyone for the sight of organized soldiers moving like a single unstoppable force. The ground trembled beneath their boots, the sound echoing through the hills like distant thunder. Samuel gathered us in a huddle. "Stay low. Watch each other. Don't move until I give the word. This is real, boys. Not drills, not stories. Real." The battle erupted suddenly. Musket fire cracked through the air, the smell of gunpowder choking us. Men shouted orders, curses, names. The ground shook with the force of cannon fire, and the world seemed to narrow to the chaos around me. I raised my musket and fired, the recoil jarring my shoulder, the smoke stinging my eyes. Around me, friends fell, some screaming, some silent, their bodies colliding with the frozen earth. I remember stepping over a man I had shared a fire with only days before. He didn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but Samuel's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Survival." The Redcoats advanced with terrifying precision. Every volley, every step forward, left devastation in its wake. I watched as a small village ahead was consumed in smoke. Homes were broken, livestock killed or stolen, and men who tried to fight back were cut down in seconds. The cries of the villagers, the women, the children, mixed with the shouts of soldiers and the explosions of cannon fire. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I had to see, had to understand what this war demanded. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The line of redcoats eventually retreated, or perhaps we were forced back. I could not tell in the smoke and mud. Bodies littered the frozen ground, wounded and dead. Some survivors tended to the injured, others stared blankly, their faces pale, mouths slightly open, as if the world itself had broken. I sank to my knees beside a small fire, shivering not just from cold, but from the shock of what I had witnessed. Samuel sat beside me, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "You saw it, Elias. War is not glory. It is fear. It is loss. And it changes every man it touches." I nodded, swallowing hard. Words failed me. Around the camp, the murmurs of the wounded, the silent grieving, and the quiet anger of the survivors created a new kind of rhythm, one I would carry with me forever. By nightfall, the camp was quiet again, but a silence heavy with death and sorrow. I thought of home, of mother and my sister, of the world I had left behind. And I realized that the America I had once imagined, the freedom, the honor, the noble fight, was buried beneath mud, ash, and blood. Yet, despite everything, we moved forward. Because if we stopped, we would be swallowed by what we had witnessed. And the war, it would not wait. The days following the battle left the camp heavy with unease. The redcoats had withdrawn, but not without leaving their mark: broken bodies, razed homes, and a fear that clung to us like a second skin. Men moved silently, eyes darting constantly, whispers threading through the tents. Even those who had fought bravely now seemed smaller, diminished by the harsh reality of what we had survived. I began noticing things I had never considered before: small betrayals, subtle lies, and the fragile loyalties among our own. One night, a man named Harris, who had always seemed dependable, was caught sneaking extra rations for himself. He claimed he was saving them for his sick sister, but the others argued he was hoarding, taking advantage of the chaos. Samuel intervened, but his eyes were tired, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his voice. I realized that fear made people act differently. It twisted their morals, sharpened their selfishness, and blurred the lines between right and wrong. I thought of the villagers we had passed, the mother clutching her child, the homes we could not save. I thought of the redcoats, precise and relentless, yet just as human as us. And I began to understand that war wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about survival, and survival often demanded choices that weighed heavily on the soul. One afternoon, we were sent to scout a small settlement rumored to have supplies. As we approached, the village seemed quiet, almost peaceful. But when we entered, we found it empty. Smoke curled from chimneys, but no one answered our calls. A child's toy lay in the road, dirt-streaked and abandoned. And then, in the far corner of a burned-out house, we found a man, barely alive, wounded from a previous raid. He begged us to help him, to take him with us. Some of the men argued we should leave him. It was too risky. Others wanted to carry him, risking the group's safety. I stayed silent, feeling the tension coil around my chest. Finally, Samuel decided to take him, moving slowly through the village, carrying the man between us. But I could see the fear in every step, not just of being attacked by the redcoats, but of failing someone who depended on us. That night, by the fire, the man we had saved whispered his thanks in a voice barely above a breath. I watched him closely, and I understood something new. Every decision in war carried consequences, some immediate, some lingering long after the smoke cleared. Some lives we could save, others we could not, and often the difference came down to chance or courage, not morality. Sleep that night came fitfully. My dreams were filled with faces: the boy Peter who had fallen last season, the mother clutching her child, the redcoat whose eyes met mine on the battlefield. I awoke cold, covered in sweat, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the camp. I realized that each morning, each day, I would face these choices again, and the weight of them would shape the person I was becoming. In the weeks that followed, I noticed other subtle changes among the men. Some hardened, their laughter gone, replaced with grim determination. Others grew silent, haunted by what they had seen, carrying their guilt like an invisible pack. Even Samuel seemed distant at times, muttering under his breath, staring at the horizon as if searching for answers that didn't exist. I began to understand that survival was more than just enduring bullets or cold nights. It was enduring the moral cost of every action. And in that realization, I felt the first true fear that had nothing to do with redcoats or battlefields. It was the fear of losing myself, of becoming someone I would not recognize, someone the war had shaped in ways that could never be undone. And so, with every day that passed, I learned to move carefully, to measure my choices, and to carry the weight of decisions I could not unmake. For war, I realized, was not just the clashing of armies. It was the slow, relentless shaping of souls, one choice at a time.